Hello, this presentation is for Stanford Medicine X, September 6, 2014. The title of the presentation is Solitary Health Habits Are Not Enough. We Need a Holistic Health Practice. Today I'm going to talk about the fast-growing movement of behavior modification technologies, the complexity of the relationship between health and lifestyle, and introduce you to the loop model to sustain health behaviors. And to begin, I'd like to give you a quick synopsis of the quantified self movement, and I'll focus on step counting as one of the most available measures from self-tracking today. Step counting is not new. In fact, the first pedometer was developed by a Swiss watchmaker in the 18th century. Pedometers became commercially available starting in the 1960s in Japan, and over the preceding years there were books that described how to use them for weight loss. They were occasionally used clinically, but they remained largely unsexy until everything changed when James Park and Eric Friedman founded the company Fitbit in 2007. And the launch of Fitbit coincided with the advent of the modern-day quantified self era. Meetups were formed, new technologies were founded, big companies got into the wearable technology game. The tech world was ablaze with excitement over pedometers mostly. And earlier this year, over 40 new wearable technology devices were revealed at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. The wearable technology market is expected to grow 14-fold in the next 5 years, from $1.4 billion today to $19 billion in 2019. So what has enabled this explosive growth and interest? Innovation. A lot of it thanks to the mobile phone market. We now have small, inexpensive sensors, wireless data streaming, cloud storage, exchange of data in the cloud, and a mobile user experience. And because of technologies like these, we also now have devices like externals, wearables, and soon we'll have biosensors which can collect data on things like our behavior, our physiology, and our environment. And the interest to collect this type of data spans two broad categories. The first is behavior change. And suddenly, perhaps for the first time in a long time, or maybe ever, behavior change seemed like a realistic solution to consider for wellness promotion and patient care. What has seemed to be this inscrutable subject all of a sudden felt like a real possibility. And the reason is because these devices make data collection easy, which then powers data-enabled behavior modification systems. So it's not just collecting data, but it's how this data collection serves to bridge a user with valid behavior modification techniques. And the second category is big data. If we're able to collect real-time, 24-hour data on a lot of people living in a naturalistic environment, and then analyze that huge volume of information, we might be able to yield insights into aspects of human nature and physiology. And it could also help us unravel differences between groups, so differences in sex and age and gender, etc., that will help lead to more personalized health directives over time. So, there's all this excitement, but is there any evidence that these devices can modify behavior? And I think the best research to date to illustrate the potential efficacy of data-enabled behavior modification systems was done by Hope Lab, who did an analysis across 6 studies with more than 1,000 school-aged children to evaluate if the step counter Zamzi, which is like a Fitbit but for kids, was able to increase moderate to vigorous physical activity levels in children. And yes, Zamzi increased physical activity by almost 60% compared to the control group. And this translates to an additional 2 marathons per month worth of activity. But did the effect persist? On the y-axis, we have minutes per week of moderate to vigorous physical activity. And on the x-axis, we have time out from baseline up to 6 months during the study period. And yes, Zamzi was able to modify behavior and sustain that effect over the duration of the study period. Zamzi is the top line in red, and the control group is the pink dots below that. Another thing that's really notable is that if you look at the very left of the graph, the effect of Zamzi took hold immediately. So these children started to utilize the device, and it had an immediate effect. So we've seen is that these systems, when designed right, they can modify and sustain some behaviors in some populations. Does this behavior even matter? So this is a slide that's looking at the consequences of inactivity. Physical activity has system-wide impacts on our physiology, and I'd like to read you this quote. Humans have inherited a genome programmed for movement from a time when physical activity was obligatory for survival. Inactivity sets off a chain of molecular mechanisms that affect the way our cells communicate, which leads to disease. So this is great. These devices can get us to move more, and of course physical activity is a requirement to sustain health, but we also see this phenomenon in the wearable tech space. This graph is activity tracker usage over time, and on the y-axis you see the rates of sustained utilization, and on the x-axis you see time out from purchase. What you see is that people who have bought an activity tracker, by 18 months, less than half of them are still using it. So far in section 1, what we've discussed is that the wearable technology market is growing rapidly, that these devices can be effective to modify behaviors like physical activity. Physical activity is, of course, crucial for our health, and how these devices are discarded over time. So one could argue that the ability of these devices to support sustained behavior change is contingent upon their continual usage. This is the problem that needs to be addressed. How do you get people to continue to engage? And I will foreshadow the latter part of the talk by suggesting that you could either aim to lower friction or increase external incentives, but you could also aim to raise the disengagement threshold by helping a user empower the device with value. And now I'd like to switch gears, and I'd like to talk about the complexity of the relationship between lifestyle and health. To do this, let's look at the condition of high blood pressure and see what affects it. Why blood pressure? Well, we could choose one of many different conditions that are typically affected by lifestyle, but blood pressure is as good as any, and it's a topic of critical importance to our health. The prevalence of hypertension in the United States during 2005 to 2008 was approximately 68 million people, or 31% of the population, according to NHANES data. Every year, hypertension is estimated to contribute to 1 out of every 7 deaths in the United States and cost the U.S. $93 billion per year, or 17% of all healthcare expenditures. So, what lifestyle parameters affect the regulation of blood pressure? Yes, physical activity is a requirement for properly maintaining blood pressure. A recent study presented in the Journal of Comparative Physiology showed that sedentary behavior creates an overactive blood pressure regulating center in the rostral ventrolateral medulla, directly causing hypertension. But other things are important too. For example, when you eat green vegetables, oral bacteria convert nitrates in the vegetables into nitric oxide, which can then modify blood pressure. Also, eating vegetables puts nitrates in your skin. And when your skin is exposed to UVA light, nitrates convert to nitric oxide. And increased levels of nitric oxide correlate with reduced levels of blood pressure and endothelial injury. We also know that sleep loss associates with elevations in blood pressure, and that aberrant circadian rhythms from things like shift work and mistimed lighting environments increases pathological remodeling of our vasculature and promotes endothelial dysfunction and hypertension. And lastly, but only for the purpose of making this point, diet and other lifestyle parameters affect the composition of our intestinal microbiota, or our gut flora. Certain types of gut bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids, which can then bind to blood pressure regulating receptors in blood vessels throughout the body. So, although we've seen that physical activity has a system-wide impact on the body, we have also now seen how multiple lifestyle parameters influence the proper functioning of our body systems, like we see with blood pressure. And all these behaviors affect all of our systems. And additionally, these behaviors affect one another. For example, physical activity levels will influence sleep quality and vice versa. So, in large part, health derives from the sum total of all these meaningful relationships over time. It has been argued that the modern day health issues like obesity, diabetes, etc., result from a mismatch of how we live and the expectancies of our genes. For 99% of the time that Homo sapiens have been on this earth evolving, our health, or proper biological functioning, has been shaped by this very intimate relationship with nature: light exposure, darkness exposure, available food sources, physical activity and rest patterns, our relationship with microbes, our relationship with one another, etc. But in modern times, our lifestyle can change at the speed of light. And here are three examples demonstrating just how rapidly things have changed. So, only in the last 50 years, jobs requiring regular physical activity have decreased by 40%. As a population, we sleep 20% less per night. This is equivalent to getting one full night of sleep loss per week. And we eat 15% more calories per day, which the best mathematical models suggest are enough calories to explain the 260% rise in the prevalence of obesity during the same period of time. So in section 2, I've shown you how blood pressure is affected by many different aspects of lifestyle, which illustrates the complex relationship between the pattern of living and proper biological functioning, or lifestyle and health, and that our lifestyle has changed drastically and rapidly, and this gene-lifestyle mismatch is a key driver to diseases of modernity. Earlier in section 1, the big question was, how do you get people to continue to engage with these health-promoting systems? And the big question in section 2 is it even possible to promote a lifestyle that fulfills all the requirements necessary to be healthy? So, whether we're talking about device engagement or promoting a more holistic lifestyle, we're talking about behavior modification. So I'd like to begin section 3 talking about behavior models. Behavior models describe, predict, or explain why behavior changes, and they can also provide a template to facilitate behavior modification. I'm not going to speak directly to the 7 well-known models presented here, but I am going to talk about some of the elements contained within them. Some models include the application of Skinnerian principles of behavioral conditioning, where a behavior is prompted by a stimulus, and the consequence of the behavior, whether it be punishment or reward, will affect the likelihood that it'll happen again. And new technologies are making triggering and reinforcement contingencies more available, practical, and immediate, which is one of the reasons why this is a really exciting time for health technology. But Skinnerian conditioning isn't enough. Health applications will be out-triggered and out-rewarded by health-impairing stimuli that exist within our environment. So while powerful and useful, it's a losing battle if we rely exclusively on Skinnerian conditioning to drive health behaviors. But triggering and reinforcement is not all that's at our disposal to modify behavior. We can go back to the behavior models to know that we must not neglect the neocortex and the inimitable capacity of humans for executive functioning. We also can harness the power of self-efficacy. Stanford psychologist Albert Bandura is a pioneer in the study of behavior change and motivation, who stated that people are proactive, aspiring organisms. And in the 60s, Bandura began to develop the concept of self-efficacy, which states that the more we believe we can meet a goal, the more likely we will be to do so. I would argue that some of self-efficacy is not simply based on one's belief in oneself, but also one's belief, confidence, and clarity in the path to achieve that goal. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to the behavior model that I developed called the Loop Model to Sustain Health Behaviors. And at the highest level, it can be described in 4 steps. The first step asks, why is this important? This is about persuasion and emotion, factors that can shape your worldview, your attitude, your motivations, your sense of desire to achieve a goal, and ultimately can influence how you see yourself in the world. It can shape your identity. We see this when people ascribe themselves to a particular health paradigm. I am vegan. I am paleo. Not I do this, but it's part of who they are. Next, How do I do it? Over the course of 24-hour period of a day, a 168-hour period of a week, what are the things that I do? How do I translate the philosophy from the why section into actionable steps? Third, am I doing it? Here, especially with new technologies, you can implement feedback loops, triggering key actions of lifestyle and reinforcing the right behaviors. And then fourth, is it working? This can include physical performance tests, mental performance tests, and blood work to get a snapshot of where you stand and insight into how your health practice is working for you. And while I don't have time to go into all the different aspects of the model, I'd like to take a few moments and describe the why component. This is not just simply about providing information. The goal is not to turn the user necessarily into a PhD on all subjects that matter, but rather to address who are you, what is the problem, how do you solve it? First, I am Homo sapiens. It's a reminder of the core nature of my being, that lifestyle gene expectancies exist within me. Because despite the fact that we all live in a modern world with modern sensibilities, we are all owners of an ancient biology that is easy to disconnect from that truth, but it's also easy to understand. And if the health paradigm upon which you base your health identity is shaken by faulty logic or based on over-speculative information, you run the risk of having the foundation of your health practice rattled by reasonable criticism. The perspective should be persuasive and defensible, but it doesn't have to be overly complex. Second, a broken lifestyle serves as a heuristic pointing to the idea that today's health issues stem from an unhealthy relationship between the very normal pattern of living today and our genes. So what's the solution? Well, I aim to solve this problem by cultivating and sustaining a holistic, sufficient, and consistent personal health practice that not only addresses the problem, but also helps me express my identity. And fourth, you can use things like commander's intent. It's a concept that plays a central role in military decision-making and planning. It acts as orders to transform complex strategy into a concise directive that helps you make good decisions in diverse situations. So, for example, giving somebody a whole book of information and then expecting them to make the right decisions in the myriad opportunities of life where you're making health choices, that can be hard. So what this does is it says, what's the main thesis? Try to convert it down into one actionable phrase that people can keep top of mind that helps them make better choices in a variety of situations that matter. And in this case, live like your ancestors. Try it now, right? Would you eat whole fruit or would you eat the highly processed flour-based cupcake? Right? There's many different types of ways where you can then test this. What would my ancestors do? So let's pull back and look to see how this can be implemented. I'm a Homo sapien. The modern lifestyle is broken. I need to establish an effective health practice to address this issue. To fulfill my identity, I can form intentions to live as an intelligent eater, an enduring mover, and a restorative sleeper. These are aspirations of what I would like to pursue in my health practice. For example, the goal of the enduring mover is to maintain a capable and a resilient body. And to do so, I can set goals to fulfill my aspirations, my intentions. In this case, it's to maintain a mixed intensity, so both high intensity and low intensity, and mixed modality, different types of stimulation to provoke mobility, strength, and endurance. And that's a part of my health practice. And then I can track aspects of my goals to let myself know if I'm living in accordance with my own ideals. So, for example, here is a snapshot of how we do this at my company, Human OS, which is in private beta. The site take the loop model to sustain health behaviors and tap into all the different aspects which make it powerful, but this is just one aspect of it. So on the far right, up at the top, you can see that we have an activity score. That activity score is made up from steps and exercise. The scores are color-coded depending on how you're doing, but you can see that it's promoting a mixed intensity movement practice. And then the activity score feeds into the health zone score, which is a composite of multiple different lifestyle parameters that we're tracking to let me know if I'm living in accordance with my own lifestyle goals on a regular basis. So in order to orchestrate consistent step tracker usage, it's valuable for the user to understand that the step counter is a good step counter and not a bad exercise tracker, that it does a good job collecting steps, and that steps matter. How steps fit into your physical activity practice, and how your physical activity practice fits into your overall health practice, and how your health practice solves a problem that you understand. In summary, how do you get people to continue to engage with these health promoting systems? We talked about that in section 1. That was the big question. The big question in section 2 is, can you promote a lifestyle that fulfills all the requirements necessary to be healthy? And even though you're adding complexity when you're driving a holistic lifestyle approach, you're also raising the disengagement threshold by tethering different lifestyle behaviors into a cohesive, purpose-driven, defensible system. So I would argue that you have a greater chance of getting people to sustain engagement if you provide context and purpose. And you have a better chance of achieving health if your behavioral aims are more complete, contextualized inside a coherent health framework. And that's exactly the purpose of the loop model to sustain health behaviors. So the more that we're enabled by technological advancement to live in a manner disconnected from origin environmental conditions present during the shaping of our gene-environment relationship, the more we do need something like the loop model to help us counteract conditions of modernity and to empower us as effective agents in our own health. And with that, I will end and field any questions that you have, and thank you for your attention.